The dramatic turn of events that has Israel and Iran in a direct confrontation in Syria. It began on Sunday with Syria claiming that Israel launched airstrikes in the country's south. Next came a rocket fired towards Israel, and that was caught on video from ski slopes on the Hermon mountain. What you see there is the Iron Dome missile defense system launching to intercept it.
And overnight, a series of Israeli strikes. The military breaking with its usual no-comment policy, going public with these aerial images and 4 targets they say they hit. Munition storage sites, a military site inside the Damascus airport, plus an Iranian intelligence site and an Iranian military training camp. The Israeli Prime Minister followed it up with this statement.
We will not ignore this act of aggression, the attempts by Iran to entrench itself militarily in Syria, or Iran's explicit statements of intention to destroy Israel, which were just uttered by Iran's Air Force chief. We are working against Iran and also against the Syrian forces who are assisting with Iranian aggression. Whoever tries to harm us will harm them. Whoever threatens to destroy us will be held accountable.
Journalist Lucy Taylor is joining us from Moscow, and our defense correspondent Daniel Tsemach joins us from the volatile Israel-Syria frontier. Daniel, let's start with you. What we just heard from the Israeli Prime Minister and from the Israeli military, it sounds like sort of the end of Israeli ambiguity.
Well, Nurit, it's certainly true. We've seen Israel straying further and further away from a policy they generally adhere to of ambiguity, as you said. But it's important to know that in this particular case, we're not talking about just another strike against Iranian assets in Syria. As far as the Israeli military is concerned, this was a retaliatory strike to an Iranian missile, which was launched from within Syria over the Mount Hermon mountain, as you described, Nurit. And in that sense, Israel is generally more transparent about retaliatory strikes as they were back in May 2018 when Iran and Israel confronted on, as you said, this volatile border. And just to give our viewers some context here, we're standing right now no more than a mile away from the Israel-Syria border. Months ago, there was a counterinsurgency campaign happening just overhead, and you could hear explosions ringing out almost at all times. So the residents here in northern Israel are certainly familiar with the sort of activity that they saw just a day ago when there was that surface-to-surface missile flying overhead in the Mount Hermon ski resort, which is just around 18 miles from where we're currently standing. And overall, it has to be said that while that ski resort will be open tomorrow as usual, the IDF does say that there will be a heightened security presence in northern Israel in light of the recent events.
Lucy, tell us about the Russian response, but let's also note that in the past, Russia has cautioned Israel. It said it's going to upgrade the Syrian air defense systems, but that does not seem to have deterred Israel.
No, and I think this does run the risk of inflaming tensions somewhat between Russia and Israel. As you've said, Russia has warned Israel in the past. In general, the relations are good between these two countries. There's two leaders, Vladimir Putin and Benjamin Netanyahu, who speak regularly, visit each other regularly. But Russia is playing a delicate balance here between trying to maintain good relations with all the different Middle Eastern countries, with all the actors in Syria. And it is difficult for Russia to maintain that balance as this confrontation between various countries steps up. So I think that this does run the risk of inflaming some tensions, and there are some signs here that Russia is feeling that at the moment. The Russian coverage here is focused very much on the Syrian casualties, saying that 4 Syrian military members were killed, 6 more wounded, that infrastructure in Damascus International Airport was damaged. And of course, Russia's main ally in this conflict is with President Assad, is with the Syrian government forces. So it is difficult for Russia to say anything else when there are Syrian government forces affected by these airstrikes. We have had some response from the deputy chairman of the Parliamentary Defense Committee here in Russia, who said that the Russian patience is limited with Israel.
All right, well, on that, Daniel, let's zoom in on one specific element of these unusual strikes. The Israeli military, as we mentioned before, acknowledging that it struck near the Damascus International Airport. We know of an Iranian plane that made its way there and and turned right around. What more can you tell us?
Exactly right, Nareed. Many experts in Israel and Israeli security officials have acknowledged that there was a suspicious flight that was a Mahan Air Iranian jet flying from Tehran destined to Damascus. And then in light of the Israeli strikes within the area of Damascus, southeastern Damascus, it was rerouted back to Tehran. Israel has long accused Iran of exploiting civilian aircrafts and cargo planes to export weapons to Hezbollah and Iranian-backed militias within Syria. This is not the first time. Also interesting, though, that today, Monday, Germany actually has implemented a ban on Mahan Air in light of security concerns. And it wasn't only a German effort. The U.S., of course, also pressuring Germany to implement that ban, but it is immediately in effect, and they're not going to allow Mahan Air, that plane that did reroute on Sunday before the Israeli strike, they're not going to allow them to fly over German skies.
Lucy, Russia has also talked about trying to restrain Iran or the Iranian influence in Syria, in perhaps in order to placate Israel. But it looks like there, too, Russia's not been that successful.
No, and I think the problem with that suggestion is that, of course, Russia does not have the power or perhaps influence over Iran to pressure Iran to doing that. They do work together as part of the Astana format talks. They are both close allies of the Syrian government. So there are connections and links between Russia and Iran. But at the end of the day, Iran is going to act in its own interests. We've seen glimpses of how Russia might try to persuade Iran to withdraw. For example, last year, Russia was negotiating with the US about possibly easing sanctions against Iran in return for withdrawal from Syria. But that suggestion was shot down from both sides, and it's difficult to see at this point how Russia will be able to exert that influence to make that happen.
All right, Lucy Taylor in Moscow and our Daniel Tsemach on the Israel-Syria border.